Right. It's 12 o'clock and it's Wednesday at noon Central Time, at least. And so that means it's time for this week's Iowa Learning Farms Conservation Webinar. And I am Matt Helmers here at Iowa State University with the Department of Ag and Biosystems Engineering and the director of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center and a faculty member involved with the Iowa Learning Farms project. And we are really fortunate today to tap into a colleague from the Department of Biological and Agricultural Engineering at North Carolina State University. Many of you that might be repeat visitors to the webinars might know one of Dr. Burchell's colleagues there at NC State University, Dr. Bill Hunt, that we've been fortunate to have on a couple of times on the Learning Farms webinar. And so today we're going to hear about an overview of carbon sequestration in ecosystems. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Michael Burchell, that's the professor and extension leader in the Department of Biological and Agricultural Engineering at NC State University. And the virtual floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you, Matt, and greetings from North Carolina and North Carolina State University. Thanks a lot for having me today. I'd like to spend a few minutes with you today talking to you about a pretty hot topic. It's on the early side, but it's something that's certainly been talking about. We're talking about more and more every day, and that's the ability of carbon to be sequestered in ecosystems. And so I just wanted to give you kind of a broad overview about some of the things that we think about and need to consider when we're considering carbon sequestration in ecosystems, and touch on a few of the things that we need to do to manage ecosystems if we're hoping to maximize that potential. So, what is carbon sequestration, and really why do we care? Well, what we've been doing is we've been trying to find ways to reduce the steady increase of carbon dioxide that we've observed since the Industrial Revolution. When I was in high school, we were taught that atmospheric CO2 was about 340 parts per million. This month, I took a look at the Mauna Loa Observatory, and they're observing around 420 parts per million carbon dioxide. And that increase is certainly real. Matt, I just realized something here. I think that I've got an old version of this presentation. If you'll work with me, I'm going to pause this one, and I'm going to start another presentation. Okay.
That is no problem at all.
Yep. I'll do it very fast. I just realized this is an older version, and I clicked on it, unfortunately. Okay, we're back in business. Okay.
Right. Turn it back over to you. There we go.
Yep. Okay. So what is carbon sequestration? So it's the process of trying to capture the CO2 on Earth and actually hold it here. However, we have to realize that this carbon sequestration is not a one-way street. There's always continual losses that we have to account for that make its way back to the atmosphere from our ecosystems. So you have to think about that. Our true net sequestration is the carbon in to the ecosystems minus the carbon out. Okay. All right, so how does this work in ecosystems? So this is a simplified carbon cycle in an upland, grassed, and forested environment here. Ecosystems pull the CO2 into the terrestrial environment through photosynthesis that convert that CO2 into sugars and ultimately biomass. And it's that biomass in both the above ground and below ground roots, both alive and dead, as well as the soil microbial community, is what is holding in that carbon. And then remember that carbon dioxide can be released to the atmosphere along with some other gases through plant and microbial respiration and decomposition. Now, if the amount of carbon coming into the system is greater than that's leaving, then that results in net storage. Okay. So where are the storage areas for carbon? So you're talking about above ground biomass, the leaves, the stems, the wood of whatever vegetation here. But you're also talking about the litter and the detritus that might be on the soil surface. Those are considered sometimes long, sometimes short pools for carbon storage. But in the soil, you've got below ground biomass, decaying biomass in soil. Sometimes, if you think about what peat is, that is decaying biomass that accumulates in soils. And then one that we don't often think about is microorganisms. Now, this carbon storage in these can result in accretion and of actually the levels of the soil. This is an example of what would happen, say, in a coastal tidal marsh when you actually have the roots expanding in the soil. And actually, I've measured where this could actually raise the elevation of the soil surface 2 to 3 millimeters per year. And so that's a pretty sizable amount of carbon that can be stored in these areas. And then the other side, another extreme example that can occur over centuries is where you can get peat accumulation. So here's a table about kind of some estimates of global carbon storage in different types of ecosystems. We've got tidal marshes, seagrasses, mangroves, tropical, temperate, and boreal forests. And one of the things that I've spent time on looking in North Carolina is tidal marshes, and one of the reasons is because the carbon storage rate is potentially so great in those areas, up to over 200 grams of carbon per meter squared per year. That kind of blows forests out of the water, so to speak. However, once you look at the total area that tidal marshes cover versus boreal forests, there's many more forest acreage than there is tidal marshes. And so when you look at it, the tidal marshes, the equivalent of carbon storage rate is the equivalent to 37 million passenger vehicles driving in 1 year. And in temperate forests, that number is more like 55 million passenger vehicles per year. The forests accumulate less carbon per year, but there's 50 times more total global area. And so they're really important areas in sequestering carbon. So many lands there's in the United States, many of our lands and many of our areas have a good climate that would be really good for carbon sequestration. So today I'd like to focus on these few ecosystems here, the upland forest, wetlands, both forested and marsh. I'll talk to you about blue carbon. Blue carbon is not something that Iowa will have much of, if I'm correct, because it deals with coastal ecosystems. And then we'll briefly touch on the potential storage in other working lands like farming operations and pastures. Of course, it's going to have to be a slant towards what we have in North Carolina, but most should be similar to what you're used to with the exception of coastal ecosystems. So I really like this graphic that I got from the U.S. Forest Service, and it kind of shows how carbon storage and release can occur in forested ecosystems. And you can go to this website, and they've got a really good informatic on all of this. So it just compares the U.S. forest stocks to emissions of CO2. In this graphic, you might be able to make out the TG, that is teragrams, or 1 times 10 to the 6 metric tons. And note, how large the emissions can be if we have the decay of this carbon, losses in fire or other things. Look how that can really take away from the sequestration potential of our forests. I like this graphic here from the EPA that shows total forest biomass. And it is showing that we're doing a pretty good job right now in increasing forest biomass. These estimates are a little bit different than those from the Forest Service, but I think it does a good job in showing, relatively speaking, where most of the carbon is stored. And you can see here that mainly the storage in millions metric tons of carbon, most of the storage is actually in the soil organic carbon. Okay, so it's in the carbon that has made its way into the soil, and that is where we really bank on these forested ecosystems to hold on to that carbon. And of course, the above ground biomass growing and dying from year to year helps to contribute to that as well, and also the expansion of the root systems beneath these systems. So let's talk about kind of overall thoughts of carbon storage in forests. In the U.S., the net sequestration of carbon, the estimates are that it offsets approximately 15% of our annual fossil fuel carbon emissions. 15% is not insignificant. And so it really underlines the importance of maintaining our forests. Again, as I mentioned earlier, soils is a major storage component. Something that you may or may not have thought much about is this concept of permanence. You know, I think that forestry gets kind of a bad rap by people that don't think about this, that, you know, harvesting trees is a bad thing. Well, actually, it's a pretty good thing, because harvesting forests in lumber actually locks that carbon dioxide in. If you think about the Liberty Bell and that yoke there from the 1770s, the carbon that was in that tree that had been taken from the atmosphere is still there. I mean, it's permanently locked in. And when you think about how long this carbon dioxide can be locked in, estimates are that, like, framings in homes, that carbon is locked in for like 100 years. Other things that are more easily degraded and burned, estimates like pallets and paper, more like 6 years. Okay. And when it comes to, forestry, density matters. And so when you do harvest a forest, you need to replant it so you can get that carbon sequestration started again. But if you have poorly stocked or understocked forests, you're going to limit the potential of having that carbon dioxide sequestered. There's a lot of questions about how much of the carbon flux out of these systems. Generally speaking, when you have higher temperatures, in different parts of the country, you can have more carbon dioxide flux. Higher soil moisture, generally have less CO2 loss because you have more potential for anaerobic conditions. But as we'll touch on later, higher soil moistures could result in having other gases leaving that we don't want as well. Something that you may not be used to seeing, but in the Southeast, our coastal forests are dying because of increases in salinities, and they result in these stands of trees that have this eerie white color that we call ghost forests, and that's not a good thing, because as these areas die back, they're releasing all of that CO2 that was in their biomass. And so that's not good for carbon sequestration overall. And, and just as a comparison, most of you already know this, the productivity and growth per year in forests in the Southeast and places like North Carolina are a lot higher here than they would be in Iowa. The forest systems are just not as extensive here as they are in North Carolina. Now, I've spent most of my career studying wetlands, and wetlands are really powerhouses for carbon storage. And as we pointed out, the tidal marshes really hold a lot of this carbon in here. And it's estimated that wetlands store between 20 and 30% of the Earth's total soil carbon, despite only occupying 5 to 8% of that land surface. And you got several things working here. You've got wetlands that have really high productivity. In other words, they're sequestering a lot of CO2. They're producing a lot of biomass above ground and below ground. But they have anoxic conditions for more times of the year. These anoxic conditions are caused by saturated or inundated conditions that cause microorganisms to use up the oxygen and then reduce the ability for that O2 to get, or oxygen to get back into the soil. And so that slows down the decomposition of this carbon. And in most of these areas, you end up having organic matter rates of accumulation that are much greater than decomposition. And so that results in creating these powerhouses for carbon storage. And so just kind of as a comparison between wetland soils and ag soils, it's pretty common to see most average wetlands to have 20 to 40% of carbon in their soils, compared to either 0.5% to 2% in active agricultural soils. So a lot more carbon in these wetlands. So stores of peat that can be meters thick are examples of ultimate below ground storage of carbon. We have this in North Carolina, and in a place like Hyde County, which is an extreme eastern North Carolina, there are farmlands there that are below sea level, and we actually use agricultural drainage and pump that drainage to be able to farm these lands. And I've been in areas surrounding these farmlands where they're still wetland, and they're 10, 15 meters deep of peat over centuries of accumulation. We have wetland systems called precosins that are notorious for having big, thick areas of peat. And I can tell you from walking around in there, you better watch where you step, because you may sink down to your waist if you're not careful. This process on the right is kind of a 25-year example of buildup of carbon. This is actually in a constructed wetland in Stokes County, North Carolina, that had been operational for 25 years. And through our monitoring of that system and working with the operators, they were continuing with 25 years of biomass accumulation of cattails and other things, and about a 1/2 inch per year. And so this graphic really means a lot to me, because I can see how fast this can happen when you have this high productivity and low decomposition rates. Although I wasn't able to do much research into it, I have long known that Iowa once had extensive wetlands, and there's still a lot of work to protect wetlands in Iowa because most of them have been drained. But I now see, I poked around a little bit, I now see that fens and probably prairie pothole wetlands in these areas once held extensive peat reserve and were mined, and perhaps are still mined today for things like potting soil. There were several old publications that I was able to dig up to see that this was going on, and a couple of companies that I saw that actually actively, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but it appeared anyway that there is some peat collection going on in Iowa for things like potting soil. And so the more of this goes on, however, that's less of the carbon that's going to be held in place. So a complicating issue to all of this is methane emissions. Okay, this is kind of a complicated little drawing here, But under extended periods of anaerobic conditions in the soil of freshwater wetlands, microorganisms can produce methane, CH4. And many of you probably have heard that methane is a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So when we have systems that are leaching methane, we have to factor that into the carbon out calculation. And so over like a 100-year time period, the global warming potential of methane is 32 times that of CO2. So that has to be, that's multiplicative in the amount of that gas that comes out of there. So that has to be factored into net carbon sequestration. So if you have a lot of methane coming out, it will somewhat reduce, but certainly not negate the net sequestration in freshwater wetland systems. So when considering wetlands, we have to consider ways to manage these ecosystems to minimize methane emissions. And commonly, this would be done by managing the site hydrology. The wetter and the wetlands that have really extended periods of saturation or inundation are generally the ones that become so anaerobic that the microorganisms produce methane. So reducing the period of complete inundation in these wetlands could help us manage some of that loss of methane. So other threats to carbon storage in wetlands, drainage results in subsidence or the sinking of the land. And this is a photo from the University of Florida that shows the land elevation of this particular location in 1927 compared to 2012. So about a 2-meter drop there. And so that can really, that really shows all of the carbon that was in that ecosystem has been burned off by microbial degradation, and that CO2 has been returned to the atmosphere. Fire is devastating to all of these ecosystems, particularly those that have really deep peat reserves. We've had a dozen or more really high-profile fires in eastern North Carolina where these wetlands that have deep peat either have been drained or go through droughts and have something happen from a catalytic converter setting off a fire to a lightning strike that will cause these areas to burn. And they don't just burn the surface, they actually burn underneath the ground. And they're difficult to extinguish. And what happens, all of that CO2 that's been in that peat slowly burns and smolders, sending all of that CO2 back into the atmosphere. So it's a huge threat. Here's a photo from the Great Dismal Swamp, quite a famous area in northeastern North Carolina. This is a photo after one of those fires. And what is, besides it just looking like a moonscape here, when I think about this from a carbon sequestration standpoint, water has filled this area in. And so the ability to revegetate this area is going to be almost impossible. It's virtually not going to occur unless we drain this area and replant and then work the water back in. And so you've lost the ability to bring carbon into the system. And so a big fire like this not only burned off what reserves were there, but it also is preventing the ability for this area to sequester carbon in the future. So I'd like to talk to you about blue carbon. Blue carbon is referred to the carbon that is stored in coastal and marine ecosystems. Again, you've got high primary productivity, shorter term storage there, and you have the detritus or the dead and decaying plant material accumulating due to anaerobic conditions and sometimes through burial, which builds soil carbon. And you can find out about everything you want to know about blue carbon at estuaries.org/blue carbon. And you can see that, salt marshes we don't have mangroves in North Carolina. Basically, salt marshes and seagrass in North Carolina are pretty powerful ecosystems in sequestering carbon. And again, mainly it's being stored in the soil carbon, as soil carbon. So again, a lot of people are talking about blue carbon around the U.S. and in North Carolina. And North Carolina has a lot of potential due to our extensive estuarine system. North Carolina currently has about 220,000 acres of salt marsh and about 190,000 acres of seagrass. And, if you remember what you saw in the last graphic, both store carbon, but the salt marsh has shown to sequester significantly more than the seagrass. And it's because of the landscape position and the ability of more biomass to be produced in the marsh. So the carbon cycle is somewhat complex in depicting it here for a marsh. Freshwater marshes can emit a significant amount of methane naturally, and since it's 30 times more powerful greenhouse gas, it can be possibly affect the carbon that tidal marshes can store in plants and soil. One of the things that I'd like to share with you is I've done quite a bit of research in looking at what brackish or slightly salty marshes can do, what their carbon sequestration potential is, particularly if we want to restore these tidal marshes, and how that would be different than freshwater marshes. What is it really that's doing that? So this is kind of as an example of how you would calculate a carbon storage potential. We looked at the carbon storage potential and value of a 14 hectare created marsh in eastern North Carolina. We looked at the carbon input, which would be above ground biomass, the litter, below ground biomass through soil cores, plant carbon content, and seasonal change. And we measured the carbon output. And we did a greenhouse gas study where we measured what gases were coming at different times of the season from the marsh. And we found there that methane emissions were actually very low because the salt water contained an endless supply of sulfate. And sulfate prevents microbes from producing much methane. But once we summed the inputs and the outputs here, we saw a significant storage below ground, low greenhouse gas outputs, and minimal organic carbon loss through erosion. We found that the marsh was indeed sequestering carbon about 40 metric tons per year. Okay. However, you have to note that, for an ecosystem like this, it would take about 500 years to build up the soil carbon pool of the surround marshes, and about 1,500 years to recoup the restoration costs if we worked on on about $17 per ton carbon equivalents that the California cap and trade economy is working from. So does that mean that restoration of these type things are a waste of money? No. These ecosystems are providing services like nutrient removal and habitat, which are additive to the overall economic value of the restoration. But, building these things just in the current economy is probably not going to pay for itself anytime soon. So what about carbon storage and working lands? There's been a recent focus on cropland and pastures on the ability to sequester carbon. I imagine that there's some talk of that going on in Iowa right now, and that's probably why I'm here to talk about this today. Much of the cropland in eastern North Carolina were once wetlands and had high soil carbon, but that has diminished significantly over the last century due to drainage and tillage. And so there are groups looking into drainage, water management, and no-till practices to increase soil carbon. But I'll tell you that, managing drainage, making these areas wetter for longer, yes, that's going to help slow the breakdown of the carbon in the soils. But I think the jury is far from decided on whether or not all of these practices are going to be able to increase the magnitude of carbon storage in these areas significantly. I think the main output for managing these areas and doing no-till is going to be to keep the carbon that's in the soils now reducing its ability to be lost, rather than significantly increasing the carbon content in these soils through time. It would take a long time to do it anyway. So carbon sequestration potential is high in many ecosystems, but here are the major questions that still remain. We need better estimates of what the outputs are, the CO2 and CH4 losses from these systems, carbon dioxide and methane. It's difficult to measure these systems. It's expensive to measure these systems. You can do it a number of different ways. A lot of people are doing eddy flux tower measurements to try to get a better feel on what seasonally and daily these CO2 and methane losses could be. And, what is the effect of our changes in climate going to be on carbon sequestration rates? We're going to have higher temperatures. That could be more biomass. But if we have more biomass, we've shown that higher temperatures are going to result in more CO2 loss. So that's a little unclear right now. Precipitation patterns, more or less rainfall. What are the implications of biomass production, hydrology, gas losses, flooding? How are those going to impact carbon sequestration in these ecosystems? And places like North Carolina, what's the effect of sea level rise going to do? Or we're going to have salinity coming in and affecting not only the biomass coming in, but also the amount of loss for die-off of our forests. So we're still looking at ideal managements of ecosystems to maximize carbon sequestration. We're trying to figure out what our realistic expectations of carbon storage should be. If we overpredict this, I think we all would love to think that these ecosystems could save us here, but if we overpredict it, it result in big estimates that fall short of real climate protection. And so I think all of us, even though I think that most people have good intentions, we should be cautious of groups that overestimate the benefits to achieve other environmental protection agendas, like water quality, for instance. So they're like, hey, we need to build these things. They're going to sequester so much carbon, and their real motivation is to protect water quality or habitat. So just be cautious of that. And the other thing that kind of keeps me awake at night is thinking about the value of retaining existing carbon in ecosystems. It's of huge importance that we don't let this go. But should you be able to trade this carbon, right? It's already there. Should you get payment for this? Or do you work out a system where payment is only developed if development is imminent? I'm going to protect this instead of putting the Walmart on it. Should we get paid for that carbon? Or should we pay for carbon stored, or if you preserve an area, should you be just paid for the additional carbon per year stored? I think a lot of those questions are still out there. So I'll wrap this up that, I think that it's correct that we're talking about this, and because the United States is so diverse that there's many climate areas and landscape positions that will make carbon sequestration continuously important. But we'll have to do a lot of management to maximize them. There's growing state government support for this. I don't know how it is in Iowa, but we have the Governor's Executive Order 80 in North Carolina that's putting a significant investment into protecting lands and actually having us try to quantify what how carbon can be held in these areas to offset our CO2 emissions. And, it comes down to the dollars many times, so pricing is going to be an issue. Can we get price per ton up to make it worthwhile for people to do this? And then really estimating what the sequestration values are in these ecosystems, I think, are incredibly important. So with that, thank you. I think we're going to go into Q&A, but I think that Matt would like to share with you a few things before we do that.
Yep. So the logistical, if you are on the webinar and in need of a certified crop advisor CEU, please email Liz Ripley. Her email is ejukums@iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. And then a plug quickly before questions for our webinar for next week is manure, ancient fertilizer in a digital age. So we have Dr. Dan Anderson from here at Iowa State University talking about manure. Okay, well, maybe we can go back to your question slide because there was somebody that wanted your email address. Okay, thanks so much, Mike. That was great, and I'm gonna take my prerogative as a moderator to ask the first question that's coming from me, because you talked about state programs. Are there programs in North Carolina to try to enhance the carbon sequestration in some of your tidal marshes? Any restoration efforts or other efforts to try to enhance that?
The governor is giving money for like task force to go out and try to make these estimates to provide to provide a little bit more information about where these areas could be targeted. But there's not as right now, there's not like a pool of money that would be just for that. But I think right now we're kind of in the fact finding portion.
Okay.
But that's good that they want to find the facts.
Yeah.
Because there could be some sort of state government funding for doing things like that. But I think this fact finding will be good for other agencies like the Nature Conservancy that could go out and use this information to go get money to do some of those things as well.
Okay, great. Question from attendees. Aside from reducing the period of inundation, are you familiar with any other factors or management techniques that limit methane emissions from wetlands?
Well, sulfate helps, but you don't everywhere you don't have sulfate, because the sulfate actually poises the soil redox higher, and microorganisms don't need to go to that next step to produce methane for the metabolic processes. None are coming to my mind right now about other ways to do that besides. I think that managing the hydrology is the most powerful thing that you can do. Reducing the period of inundation.
There's, I guess, kind of a question tied, kind of related. When managing to increase carbon sequestration or reduce methane emissions, should we not also be considering effects on nitrous oxide emissions?
So nitrous oxide emissions generally comes from like incomplete denitrification that can happen. So you got kind of competing things there. Incomplete denitrification sometimes comes from wetting and drying. So that's an important point. But some of these areas are not going to have a ton of that, because they're not going to have, unless they're receiving a lot of nitrogen from their watershed. I would imagine that those numbers would be small. We did measure nitrous oxide in our tidal marsh, and we had a little bit of agricultural drainage water that was actually we diverted into the tidal marsh during that restoration, trying to do a little bit of water quality. And we just did not see very much nitrous oxide emissions from there. Now, as you move further upland, maybe that changes some. I'm not as well versed in the nitrous oxide that come from working lands, but I do know that many researchers are seeing that as something that occurs. When I think, sometimes I face this question about we shouldn't rebuild wetlands because of the greenhouse gas emissions. I hear people say that sometimes, and I kind of just boil it down to the simple fact that over half of our wetlands in the United States are gone, and when those wetlands were here, they were producing methane. They were producing these other greenhouse gases. So I think that the values of these often offset, the drawbacks of methane and nitrous oxide emissions.
Well, more here. One is, what if the quote ideal management for carbon sequestration actually isn't the ideal management for that ecosystem? How do we keep ecosystems healthy via management and sequester carbon? I think maybe an aspect is how do we manage for multiple different outcomes?
That's a hard question. I think a hard and fair question that I'll probably have to pass on. What I've learned through years of working with wetland ecosystems, you have to kind of prioritize, what you want your major function to be. If you've got a wetland that you're protecting or building for water quality enhancement, and you need to make sure it's anaerobic because you want this wetland to suck the nitrogen out through denitrification, then you're going to have to manage that wetland, the hydrology of that wetland to meet that goal. You may lose a little bit of methane because of that. Although some of the research that I've read and that has been done with some of my colleagues, wetting and drying is not so bad for nitrogen removal. And so you might be able to, things like nitrogen removal, you might be able to meet simultaneous goals. But it's going to be site specific, and it's going to be, what were the previous goals that you were hoping to achieve, and how were they prioritized? It's a good question.
So maybe this one specific to the work there on the tidal wetlands and ecosystems, it is, what properties of tidal wetlands and ecosystems do you think we need to study in order to better classify their carbon sequestration potential?
I think it is, I think we need to know a little bit more about what drives biomass production and how much loss we have to export in the intertidal zone. Like how much of that carbon gets flushed out, and what things how can we model this and predict this? I can tell you that the one that we built on, literally was a corn farm. Believe it or not, cornfield at about 2.5 to 4 feet above sea level, and we surveyed surrounding marshes, and this actually led into a marsh, drained into another marsh, and we lowered the elevation to make it intertidal, and added topsoil that we had excavated back. And we did not in that landscape position, we did not measure a significant amount of outflow of carbon. Also, we did not get a lot of carbon brought in with the tides that got buried in that area either. So it was a little bit disconnected. So I would say, you know, those tidal marshes that maybe are a little less frequently flooded would probably be the ones that we may see the most carbon sequestration, because we'll have less loss.
Right, Mike. I think that really gets most of our questions, and hopefully for our webinar series, it kind of starts some presentations over time on some of this carbon sequestration, maybe in different areas of the U.S., because this is certainly fascinating. Work at North Carolina State University certainly has relevance, but to see what some of the potential carbon sequestration rates might be in some of the tidal marshes was fascinating, and also that 2-meter decline with the peat in Florida. That was, I think I'll remember that picture. So thanks a lot, and thanks folks for tuning in to the webinar today. Again, if you need a CCA credit, email Liz Ripley, ejucums@iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today. And then please tune in next week to hear from Dan Anderson about manure. So with that, thanks everybody for attending.